is everyone settling in? We're comfortable, we're refilled. Are we ready for story time?
I think we're ready.
Story time. So first and foremost, welcome, and how wonderful to have each and every one of you here partaking in this adventure. Oh, I am so excited. The idea of stories and sharing experiences is quite simple and universal, but yet it's a lost art across many generations, which is why Living Legacies was formed, to kind of reconnect that through the stories. And I am just like giddy and completely just over the moon with having this dynamic group of women here in my house who want to share and socialize and soak in a few pearls of wisdom with other women and be inspired, which, you know, is just, it's refreshing. So having said that, for many of you, you know that I enjoy quotes, and there's a much loved proverb that I would like to share with you this evening that that seems fitting and kind of goes something like this. A rose will never be a sunflower. A lily will never be a tulip, but they're all beautiful in their own way. And it's exactly like us in this room. We're all so different, and to celebrate the uniqueness of women and embrace our individuality is actually, you know, it's where we want to learn and grow and bloom together. So that's kind of, again, part of this whole process. Gosh, I guess I could talk for a long time, but without, you know, further ado, allow me to introduce Mary Leavens Schwabauer, our first living legacy. She is just an amazing woman. You will definitely leave mentally nurtured and energized by the stories that she will share with us tonight. I am a better person for myself, for my family, and for my community for knowing her. So I pass the torch to you.
Thank you. Well, I don't plan to be a Mother Superior, nor do I plan to be something that will be an icon. But I am more than willing to share some of the past with you, because from every tidbit you might glean something, and from some of the experiences you may feel that there is maybe a modicum of wisdom. Just to begin, I was not born in the United States. And recently, since my husband passed away, I've discovered that is a real challenge, because I had to go in and corroborate with my Social Security number, and they were not going to let me renew my Social Security because of my birthplace. And so it was rather interesting to convince them that being born outside of the country with American parents and American passports with them, I had a dual citizenship, which remained until I was 21. And had I been a male, I might have been charged by the Mexican army to serve in their army for 2 years as one of their citizens, as they do for their young men. And I think young women. However, that would have been a long time ago. Anyhow, we were living there, and the circumstances were interesting, because Oaxaca at that time was a very small community. It wasn't the destination for everybody from around the world that it is now. So that facilities and living conditions were very limited. However, my mother acquired, before I was born, a Zapotec Mixtec Indian. Now, those were the Indians who occupied Mexico before the arrival of the Spanish. So that when the Spanish came in, they were not only attacking the Aztecs, but they were attacking also the mountain Indians, who were the Mixtecs, whom they never conquered. She, was born at a time when Mexico was having one of its revolutions, and she's now 104. So this was in 1912, and the army was going through shooting anything that moved, so that those of the families that survived were eating anything they could find. She said we ate bark, we ate dirt, we ate anything that might fill a place in our stomachs and keep us going. When she left there, she was able to find a job with an American engineer, and he and his wife kept her as someone in the home to help. And then eventually she ended up down farther in the mainland part of Mexico in a community that was Oaxaca. And my mother acquired her as a helper when she was 15, and mother gave her her first pair of shoes. So that when she told her grandsons that she had gone barefooted and had her first pair of shoes when she was 15, these were youngsters who had grown up in the 20th century and had them when they were beginning their walking processes, and of course wouldn't have thought of going to school without them, found that that was something they couldn't really understand, and something that they accepted, but they were glad it wasn't they. Anyhow, they brought Apollonia up here with us, and she is still alive. We see her regularly. She is failing badly, but it's interesting. We're still her family, and she is still my family. So that when I call her, oh, my Mary, because she was with my folks when I was born, and that's 1926. The folks weren't there very long. Dad had a terrible case of not only pneumonia, but he also had heart problems and other illnesses that necessitated his coming home, which he did, and we settled in Santa Paula. And we had been there for 3 weeks, and one night there were all the neighbors, the Hispanics were coming up the hill yelling, the waters are coming, and the dam had broken, the St. Francis Dam. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody knew anything about it, other than all of a sudden there was this wall of water coming down the valley from they didn't know where, wiping out everything in its path, and most didn't know that they were hit until it was too late. It was an experience that really galvanized the community, because for one thing, the person who was responsible for the dam later took responsibility for it, which was in some cases unfortunate, because his inexperience in geology would not have had him put the dam there to begin with had he known. But he was a man who was working for a water system that entailed 300 miles of water without any power to push it down the hill. So that from the highest mountain, there was a slight slope the entire distance from the Sierras down to the Los Angeles places of collection, and in some cases they were in behind other dams for the city water supply, and other places they were put in large pools and used as a resource in the communities. But the amazing thing was that he did it as the Romans had done it, because the Romans had no way to pump either. So their water supply and all of the building that they did with stone was the same sort of a thing, same sort of a slant. Not enough to stop it, but enough to have it roll slowly enough that it would reach its destination without any power. To this day, those events in Rome and that event in California have never been matched. And the amazing thing about engineering now is that all of those could have been corrected in the last 20 years, but they did it with a natural flow at no cost. In other words, you were getting the water just because it was processing down without the cost along the way. It's quite different now. When we settled in Santa Paula, there were additional members of the family, My sister was born shortly after we arrived, and then a brother and a sister, so there were 4 of us. And Mother never let us forget that all 4 of us came in 5 years. She was quite sure that that was an experience that she would never recommend to anybody else, and one that caused consternation and heartburn periodically all the rest of her life because of the various activities that were accomplished by members of the family, especially my brother. My brother had his talents for not only getting into trouble but also making trouble for other people. Of course, we were all quite angels. Our summers were interesting because in 1929, my grandfather decided he needed a place by the ocean. And for those of you who are familiar with the ocean in the Ventura area, you know where it is, what it is, and how it acts. And he wanted a place where he could be accessible to it and yet not have it near the town. In those days, the road to Santa Barbara was 2 lanes. There was no water. There was no electricity. We had gas, and we had a telephone line, and that was it. So water was brought in, and the biffy in the back was what everybody used, because that's all there was. And as time went along, the view from the back through the house of the ocean got wider and wider between the boards in the house, because between the winds and the changing seasons, why, they began to shrink. But it was comfortable down there in the summertime, and everybody enjoyed it because in those days, we didn't have surfboards yet. But my mother discovered that you could ride a wave if you could fill a pillowcase with air after you soaked it in water. So she began buying by the yard unbleached muslin, and I tell you, we'd have them twice the size of the chest over there, and fill them with air running against the wind, tie them tightly, and then race out as fast as you could to ride as many waves as you could before you had to pump it up again. And if you don't think that was funny, with 5 or 6 of those balloons popping up and down, each racing for the same wave, or waiting to at least come in on the beach, because in those days, you know, with no water to rinse off, you had to do that in the ocean. And so everybody by the end of the summer looked like a brown berry with a few big fat blisters. And of course, the cancer over the years that has resulted from our ignorance at that time has been most pronounced in my redheaded sister, because she didn't have any more covering than the rest of us, even though we all used not calamine lotion, but the zinc oxide. And she would be white here and pink all over the rest of her. And so she's had her challenges. None of us have had the lovely black one. What is it? Yet. But at any rate, in those days, life was so simple that, you know, the idea of getting cancer was so unknown to everybody. The only thing you could really get was a bite by a dog or a stingray. And those were plentiful on occasion, too. The nice thing about it, too, was we were always there for grunion hunting. And if any of you have ever gone grunion hunting, you know it can be about as much fun as any other time at the beach in the evening. And of course, then the next morning you'd have it fried for your breakfast, because you didn't have to clean it. It was just very quickly done. You just kind of squeezed it out and put it in the frying pan, and that was it. Those kinds of experiences you don't see very much anymore. And for those of us who still have places down on the beach now with neighbors, it's quite a contrast, because in those early days it was just a few families with 1 or 2 houses here and there. Now it's cheek by jowl with the frontage into the 7 figures for those who've had their properties there for a long time, whether you use it or not. Lots of them now rent a great time of the year, so that makes a difference in their bottom line. But the beach summers were always interesting, and it was a time when my mother could escape. She didn't have neighbors. She was a very interesting woman. She was a first-generation German. My grandmother had to in order to have a workforce on their Kansas farm, my grandmother had to produce them. So she had 5 sons. Then she had 5 daughters. And that was the workforce. And my grandfather had the horses that the boys soon learned how to handle. And everybody knew how to feed. And everybody knew how to feed the chickens, how to kill the chickens, how to fix the chickens. And the same thing with the turkeys. And the summers, Mother said, were just terrible because they'd have a huge garden and then they canned. Because that was the way they had the vegetables through the wintertime, and there was no waste. So you'd have the meat from your chickens and your pigs and your other animals there. They never mentioned sheep, and I think one of the reasons is that sheep are inclined to be a little more persnickety. Pigs are pigs, just pigs. And then, of course, cows you always have to have because that covers everything. Your butter, your milk, your cream, and that is as important a part of the value of a meal on a farm as almost anything else is. Because once you have those basics, you can always scramble eggs along with the other cream. And it makes eating on a spare farm much easier when you do it that way. But anyhow, she grew up on a farm where they raised wheat, and your day was controlled by the sun. So when the sun went down, the day was finished, and you went to bed. And when the sun came up, before the sun came up, you were on your way. And 3 meals a day, and that was part of the responsibility of the women. And interestingly enough, one of the things my mother discovered when she was about I think she was number 9, no, she was earlier than that because her sisters were younger. So she was about number 7 or 8 in the numbers coming. And by the time she was 6, she had learned to sew. And eventually, by 8, she was making the shirts for the brothers, the dresses for the sisters, because going into town was virtually impossible. Buying fabric was expensive, and the money from the grain was never used so much as for the upkeep of the family as it was to purchase more land, so that there would be more to farm, more to invest, because when each son married, my grandfather gave them a farm, so that each one was settled, and they were all married in their teens practically. They were all ready to be independent. It was interesting for the women, though. He didn't do that for any of the girls. And the eldest daughter, my Aunt Lydia, had her first child when my grandmother had her last, number 14. And this was pretty standard in the community. 10 grew to adulthood, and 4 passed away during that period of time. But the interesting thing is that that was so standard in most communities because they had no other way of getting help on any of their farms other than producing it themselves, and starting when the kids were little. When the marriages started taking place, why, of course, the sisters started to leave, and none of them stuck around, and each one went in different ways. 2 of them married, one married an engineer, one married a doctor. And if any of you have been to your ophthalmologist lately and seen a little thing that has the letters of different sizes, the E's and so forth to identify, my uncle was the one with his father, they were both ophthalmologists, who developed that because they worked through the schools testing the vision of children, and they found that they had to have something to use in order to at least get a good idea or a relative idea of the vision of the children. So he devised that, and that was one way, the first way, that they used for testing the vision of school children. So it started in the 30s, and it's one of the few advantages in those early days that the youngsters were given. It was up to the parents then to determine whether the glasses were obtained for the youngsters or not. But at least the parents knew that if there was a problem, they had to do something about it.
I'm going to pause you for a second. And are there any questions up until now to ask Mary?
ordinary family.
Grunion recipes or anything?
You know, the eye chart, is it called Snellen? Is his name Snellen? That's what we call him.
The what is?
Snellen, the eye chart?
Oh, is that what you call it now?
Yeah, Snellen eye chart. So I was just wondering if that's his last name.
No, his last name, interestingly enough, was Good.
Oh.
And he developed a good light which illuminated the same thing so that he'd flick it in his office. Well, the family, that particular family has continued, and for those of us here in Ventura County, my grandparents on my dad's side came out in 1900, and it took about 6 years to get out here because you would travel a certain distance, work, and then travel after you saved the money. Consequently, my dad was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, on the route out here. And when they finally arrived in 1900, they settled for briefly in a boarding house in Los Angeles. And my grandmother went to a prayer meeting one night, and the woman sitting next to her was saying that they were visiting, and my grandmother was saying they were just in town looking for some place to go, and the woman sitting next to her said, well, you know, she said, we have a hardware store up in Santa Paula, and my husband is looking for someone to come and help us. Do you suppose your husband would be interested? Well, that was the answer to prayer, I'll tell you. And they got on the train and went to Santa Paula. And my grandfather had come out because of health. And he was told if he didn't, he would die because he had lung problems. So they found a place in Upper Ojai to live. And my grandfather would ride a donkey each day from Upper Ojai into Santa Paula to the hardware store and then back up the hill at night. And $1 a day was his pay. And that was a pretty standard wage for a 14-hour day because the hardware man didn't get much more. And it gave him a job, which he hadn't had before. It also began giving him identity because it wasn't very long, and my grandfather brought my grandmother and my dad and their daughter into Santa Paula. And that made a huge difference because for the first time my dad now had some who were peers, and my aunt, who was never a normal person, she was never able to do anything. She could never talk, she could never walk, she could never feed herself. It made it easier for my grandmother to take care of her as time went along. I don't know how my dad managed because my aunt was always a part of the family, but yet never part of the family because she was never a person with whom you could identify, nor was she a person with whom you could, well, what would you like to do? Or, do you want to play with this? You know, it was always just noises and thrashing, so that even getting close to her was difficult. But the thing was, it taught us not only patience on the part of my grandparents, but also an understanding that some things are thrust on you whether you like them or not, and by damn you live with it. And they did. They never had help, except as later on my grandmother had help in the home. And they never, Grandpa never complained. And Grandma never complained. Oh, well, you know, never. Which in retrospect was quite astonishing because she was very demanding and always had to be fed and taken care of to the bathroom and all the rest. And in fact, which really surprised me, she even had her menstrual cycle until she was 55 that had to be resolved. But all of that was part of the fact that as a family, it doesn't matter who you are, you're still an integral part of it. And regardless of how it was a reaction for us or anybody else, that was life. And there was never any problem with it or any discussion. The only problem that we had later on as we matured was when we, some of us were getting close to marriage. we questioned, and the first thing we did was to go to the family doctor. And was this a hereditary characteristic, which was a concern, because my sister, who passed away last spring, became a psychiatrist, and so the process, of course, is MD. And that was one of the first things after she was in med school, was to go to our family doctor to question, because I'm not sure what the decision would have been individually had it been that possibility. Shall we or not have children? But when he confirmed and felt that it was not hereditary, that it was something that was either an illness or just one of those happenstances during the pregnancy, because pregnancies at that time, if they came to fruition, that in itself was a miracle. So anyway, that was just another side in our family that not too many people knew about, because it was not shared, and she didn't get out, and there were very few visitors to the home, so that it wouldn't be a community interest. However, when my dad was younger, my grandmother would have him take her for a walk, and I think that made a huge difference in my father as he matured, having to be the big brother for this sister, and knowing that there would never be an improvement. When my grandparents traveled, they went to Alaska several times. They took her, and every time they went east on the train to visit family relatives, and when Dad went to Princeton, they took her. And all of this at a time when most of those people were being housed in hospitals or unseen locations. And what I, in retrospect, have so admired my grandparents for, they didn't hide it, and they didn't express shame for it. It was just part of the family.
Matt, then what year, what time period is that?
All through the 20s, 30s, 40s. My aunt died in, let's see, about 55.
Because I remember, JFK had a sister that, and the father was shamed, and they sent her off to an institution and gave her partial lobotomy. I mean, it was just one of those things that people did not want to deal with. So
I think it depends on the strength of the family, and I don't think my grandfather had his peculiarities, but one of them was I never heard, and he was the basic caregiver of my aunt for everything, feeding her, changing her clothes, everything, because my grandmother didn't always, towards the end, have the strength for it. And I never heard him complain, never heard anybody say, well, what, ever.
It speaks a lot about his character, then.
Well, I think it's characteristic of the fact that there was a strong religious environment in the home, and it could have been the feeling that this is my burden, and we will face it, and we will live with it, and we'll go on with it. And at some point, in fact, she outlived my grandmother, and she didn't quite outlive my grandfather. But and she didn't outlive my dad by too many years. I mean, my dad didn't outlive her by too many years. But it's interesting that she was never shunted to the side when the children would come in. She was still a part of the family and sat at the table with the rest of us. And for Thanksgiving dinner, for evening supper. So it was just part of the family.
Susan,
Mm-hmm.
you're having an issue on your video.
Oh, it's off.
It's off.
Oh, is it off? Or did it just pause?
Okay. I couldn't see it, but
Oh,
it
it says low
you're in such a lovely mode. I didn't want to interrupt, but I saw that pop up and I thought, oh,
Thank
she'll
you.
want that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, now excuse me.
Thank you. I appreciate
He
it.
said he was getting messages.
Yes. It's Cody's phone, so I said no text messages or emails.
There you go.
Any other questions before we transition into the next phase? No? Fascinating.
Well, I don't want to bore you.
You're not.
Not at all. Well, I can ask you a fun kind of question if you want.
No, I don't stand on my head.
How would you describe the perfect day for you when you were young as a child? What would a perfect day look like?
Oh, it's probably at the beach. Because we were virtually unfettered. And there wasn't somebody to say, no, you can't do that, or no, you don't do that. Or,
What part of the beach were you at?
do you know Faria?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, we've been there since 1928.
Oh. Wow. Were you near the Hardisons?
They were farther down,
Okay.
and we were up by the park. You know,
Oh, okay, yeah.
by the Faria Park. And interestingly enough, my grandfather, this is again going back into Ventura County history, Manuel Faria came from Portugal. And he selected that site because it was open space and the islands reminded him of home. Mm-hmm. There was nothing. And he found a woman who was working on one of the cattle ranches in the Santa Paula area that he decided he wanted to marry. And it was after Grandpa had opened his little store in Santa Paula. He finally bought the store where he'd been working for an hour a day, $1 a day. And she came in to see him, and she asked him if he would help her get a wedding dress. And Grandpa said, of course. She says, well, I am going to marry Manuel Faria, and I need a wedding dress. And so Grandpa helped her get the fabric for it. And she made the dress, and she paid him, continued to pay after she got the fabric, 25 cents a week for the fabric until it was paid for. I don't know what the cost was at the time. But the thing that interested us so much was that was the first contact with the Farias that we had. And then eventually, when Grandfather went out to look at the property, it was Manuel Faria's property. Mm. And he told Grandpa exactly where to select the spot. Mm. He says, you don't want down there and you don't want up there, you take that spot right there because the waves are right, the beach is right. Mm. And so that's why we have that particular location where we are. But he was quite a remarkable man too, because he had been out there and dry farmed. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about dry farming, means you depend on the weather. Mm. And he found he could raise lima beans because of the fog. And so he put in limas on the slopes, mm-hmm. and he would pray for sun in the fall when he cut them, that there would be enough for them to dry. And he did that for a very long time, and always with a horse, and maintained that as his territory up there while the rest of us were down on the beach. But they've been very generous to the county. The Farias have established a foundation account with Ventura Community Foundation, and regularly meet as a family to make distributions from the fund that they have in the foundation for community causes, which has been very, very nice for those in the county who get to them in time for them to review their needs and so forth.
So Mary, is that Roberta Baptiste? Is she?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, daughter.
Yeah, she's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, you can see why there's so much closeness still with that family and with us, because her brothers would come down, and of course they'd have the beers at our place at the beach because they had the house next door to us until he died, and then somebody else bought it. But there was always a closeness with many of the early families, and Grandpa was very fond of them, and they of my grandfather. And then, of course, when all of us were there, and I used to work at I taught in Ventura for years, and the person in the cafeteria preparing the meals for the kids was Roberta's daughter. So there's a long relationship there. But then, moving the family along a little bit, in 1939, this is a little bit of U.S. history, there had been much discussion in Europe about what was happening in Europe, and it was all under the table. because the philosophy of the United States government at the time was we were to isolate ourselves from Germany and its disagreements and maintain our own solidarity and our individualism, and we were not going to have anything to do with them. Roosevelt was very farsighted, as was Eleanor. And he began a discussion with Churchill under the table, so that as war became more and more imminent, Churchill would know he had a friend. And that was mandatory because it gave him the courage when the Germans were approaching and the French were being destroyed and the Dutch were being walked on, to know that there would be help. One of the ways they did it was to send the young men over in the RAF to be trained here in the United States. And they had established a base in Jacksonville, Florida, where they were developing an airport that had everything. It had the machine shops, it had the pilot training, it had the opportunity and the weather and so forth, so they could do it 12 months of the year. In order to accomplish this, Roosevelt needed a much larger group than were in any of the services. Between World War I and World War II, there were men who had remained in the services, either the Army or the Navy or the Marines, through that 20-year of peace in the reserves. And Roosevelt began in 1938, very quietly, under the table, to start calling in the reserves. And the reserve officers and men would suddenly get a letter in the mail and, gee whiz, do I have to do this? And it was mandatory, just the same way as it still is if you're in the service. My dad got his letter in about 1940, late 1939, 1940. He had been in WW1, stayed in the reserves in the interim period, and had become, I think, a lieutenant. And so when he got his letter, he felt, well, I guess I have no choices. He had already done other experiences in Arizona with the CCC, the Conservation Corps, which had, by the way, no, you don't live on the right side of the hill. On my side of the hill, where I'm up in the Fairview, we have long handmade ditches that come down the middle of some of the places where we put in orchards. That was done by CCC during the Depression when they provided jobs for men who didn't have them. And it was the Conservation Corps that did it all over the United States. And they did bridges, they did roads, they did all kinds of projects that kept them busy, gave them jobs, and gave them money. And the fact that they haven't done anything like that, to me, is rather interesting, that they haven't felt the need for it. But anyhow, when Dad got his information that he was to go on his way to the service, the destination was Florida. And for a family that had been raised from the beginning of the little beginnings of everybody in Santa Paula, the idea of crossing the continent was just rather traumatic. But on the other hand, it provided an adventure that no one in our family could ever have imagined. And it was something that I never thought we could ever do, but we did. We picked up everything in the house, moved everything in the house, and took it to Florida. Well, we'd never seen hurricanes. We'd never seen mile-wide sand beaches. We'd never seen a state that didn't have anything higher than a tree. We drove down to St. Petersburg or St. Augustine or St. Petersburg, either one, and it was just a pancake all the way, so that when hurricanes came through, they just went right across the state because there was absolutely nothing to stop them. Anyhow, when we got to Florida, the idea of living there had been a puzzle and an adventure, and it was something that it's a good thing we did. For one thing, Dad enjoyed being in the service. we found getting out of Santa Paula a real experience. And we discovered living in a community where there were drinking fountains for blacks and drinking fountains for whites, and you didn't mix the two. Something we had never believed existed. We went to school and there were no black students, they were all white students. And on the buses it was the same split. But at that time it hadn't reached the agitating point where everyone was bothered by it, because they were still living as they always had. It was just an accepted thing, and this is the way we do it. And as the war progressed, it remained that way for a time after, as you know, and you know the progress of the changes after that.
Had you experienced here integration with Hispanics, so therefore that was odd to you, or how was that? I mean,
We didn't really notice it that much because the town was divided between the blacks and the whites. And the only one time you would see the Negroes was when they came to work in the yards and in the homes and that sort of thing.
in Florida or
In
here?
Florida.
So what about here?
Many of the Hispanics feel that they have been abused that way. But I never felt it going all through schools here, the way that they seem to feel that it took place. I know there was always difference in housing, but part of that was cost, as it still is. And it doesn't matter who you are or your background. If you can't afford to live here, you have to live there. And but I never noticed it. However, in Santa Paula, they did have a school, the Barbara Webster School, that was just for Hispanics. And the beauty of it was they were taught English. And it wasn't until later in our schools that we made the real effort to encourage the Hispanic students in Moore Park to learn English. And I know when I was teaching there, I would have the little youngsters whose mothers were in the Strawberries when I was doing a couple of years in kindergarten. And the little kids would come in, no English, not a word. They left kindergarten and they were all speaking English. And there was no Spanish, English help. It was all in English. And by the time the youngsters left high school, they read it, they wrote it both English and Spanish impeccably. And I have had always great pride in the fact that I felt that there was no advantage taken of the youngsters, that there was always an encouragement. And the best thing was the kids made the effort. There was every kid who wanted to participate, and when they were on the playgrounds, it was both Spanish and English. They were all speaking it because the English-speaking kids picked up the Spanish, and the Spanish kids picked up the English. And by the time they got into 3rd and 4th grade, you know, they were all talking, and there were no problems. So it's been from that perspective here in our community. I feel we have done very, very well by our youngsters, and the parents can be very proud of what the Hispanic kids have done as well as the American English-speaking kids have done. But anyway, going back to the war, it was an interesting experience because they brought in the English pilots as well as radio men and mechanics to learn at our base how to fly and how to repair. So they would be there 6 months or 8 months. And when they went back in 1940, it was for the Battle for Britain. And the survival rate of those who had been there was very, very minimal because they were the ones who were going up every day. And my sister and I went to England after the war and made a point of visiting one of the men's families who had been in our home. And that would have been 1951. He was killed in 42 or 3. And the father never recovered from the death of his only son and was still in mourning and still unable to cope with life as a result of that. But the fact that he had learned to do the flying and had done well, and it was just, you know, overwhelming numbers at that time in the battle was part of it. But it was marvelous experience because we lived in a whole different environment, and it was the first time many of us that had known that there were other people from other countries who still spoke English. We invited them into our homes, and the time during the war for us was an experience that for the first time our family knew that there were other people in other parts of the world. Living in small towns where all you knew was the Santa Paula Chronicle. And that's who died that day or who went to school there. It was a good time.
Were you rationing? I heard there were different rations in different regions of the country. Did you find that to be the case or not necessarily?
Everybody shared. And I can remember when we came, we had to be careful driving across the country because Mother was given a measured number of gas tickets. And since we didn't have tickets for meat, we could buy it in the market or in the restaurants, but we couldn't buy it in the markets. But let's see, we couldn't buy toothpaste.
Did you use vegetable oil for motor oil? I heard that was being done in some areas. Did you guys ever do that?
No,
Okay.
we stuck to the real thing.
Yeah.
I think it depended on where you were living.
Yeah.
Where the demand may have been greater in other places than where we were. But it was really interesting because, boy, there wasn't any place you could go. There was not any place. And you walked all over. Fortunately, the town was small, so that we were able to get around very easily. But that, I think the fact, and then when the war was over, we can forget about that because it's long past. It was interesting because living in Santa Paula, there was a huge group of what they call displaced persons after the war who were artistic, who were professional, who were all kinds of things, who suddenly decided they could pick lemons. And so they were allowed to come over because we were in dire need of pickers then as in now. And none of them could speak English. None of them had been outside of their own countries. And so the idea of having somebody who has gone all day picking lemons and come back utterly exhausted was strange, particularly if he'd been a scientist or a school teacher who had said that he was a farmer at heart and so could pick lemons. And my mother was bilingual still. She maintained her German from her youth because that was the only language they spoke in their homes. So she started visiting them, and they were having a difficult time adjusting. So Mother decided she was going to show them how to can tomatoes. And that in itself was an interesting experience because everything was in short supply. You couldn't buy canning jars, you couldn't buy sugar, you couldn't buy any of the things that were incremental in doing that sort of thing. So finding enough jars and finding enough sugar for this task and for the DPs to learn how to can tomatoes in itself was a challenge. But she had a wonderful time because they were all learning the English language, and by the time they had worked their way out of picking lemons into a job that they knew how to do, why, they all spoke English. And so they were able to get jobs. But it was an interesting period. But all of that was after the war, and it took a long time for the lifestyle and the understanding of Americans and Europeans to realize that what had happened was catastrophic for everybody. My sister and I visited Europe in 1951. There wasn't a city left in 1951. They still hadn't recovered. So that when they're talking about the damage in all these cities and the places where the wars are going on, the idea of ever having the cities recover to anything that they were before, I don't know how they'll ever do it because it took millions of American dollars in help from all over the world for Germany and France and England to recover. And I don't see that same kind of generosity from the rest of the world in many of these other nations. But the point I'm trying to make is that after that war that was so destructive to everybody, 30 years after, because we were there in 51 and then we went again later, the difference in the cities was so astronomical. The attitude of the people was just quite different too, because right after the war, everybody was suffering and everybody was equal. But then 30 years later, they were back to normal. You know, this is mine and that's yours, and you know. So it just shows that human nature is pretty much the same almost any place.
I have a question.
Sure.
Did you experience, because I have some German heritage on my mother's side, and they were living outside Chicago at the time, and my mother's mother, and she had older brothers, and they were German, and they spoke German in the house, and the older brothers were very loyal to the old Germany, the pre-Nazi Germany, and they wanted to be loyal to that, and their neighbors didn't understand. And they thought they were, you know, supporting the Nazis or something, and they were harassed and so forth. Did you experience anything like that, having a German?
No, Mother
German
did during
name?
World War I. They were afraid their barns were going to be burned. And there were barn burnings regularly and murders regularly on the part of those who felt the Germans shouldn't be there. They're taking something away from them. But not in World War II, because I think there was enough of a window.
Or maybe it was World War I.
I think it may have been one, because the feeling was very, very strong.
Yeah.
And enough so that they were afraid sometimes to go into town. Yeah.
Yeah, she didn't want her older brothers to leave the house. She was afraid
For
they'd
fear.
be killed. Or,
Well, that was WW1. There were enough of us who'd intermarried by the time 2 came along that that identity was gone.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what else you feel that you would like to know about my past, other than we've lived here in the county all our lives. And I've been a school teacher for most of those years, and then in recent years, after I retired, I've done a great deal of volunteering, which I have found to be very, very satisfying. And one of the things I've discovered is the foundation, because in the foundation we started with a very small scholarship fund of $5,000 in 1994, 95. This coming year we will give away $2.5 million in scholarship funds. And one of the reasons is because an attorney in Thousand Oaks felt he had stood out in front of Vaughn's, you know, the Vaughn's there on Moore Park. And, okay, kids, when you come in here, I'll give you my phone number, and you call me, and I'll give you some money for school. And that materialized into a large fund of several $million, which he invested in the foundation in 2000. From that fund now, we've started giving 4-year scholarships, $4,000 per year for a total of 4 years at $20 grand if you maintain your GPA. And I'm sharing this with all of you because it's time for you to be thinking about children in your family or friends who are looking for scholarships, because it will be time for them to begin searching for sources in the county. And the foundation has, trying to think I think we have 300 donors of various sizes with different descriptions. In other words, you have to fit the description of the donor to qualify to even apply. And there's a huge variety. But it will pay you to inquire to see if you can use that, or your children can use it, or grandchildren. Because, as I said, the scholarships from this one fund were the $20,000 over 4 years, and we're usually able to give, last year we gave 22 $20,000 scholarships. And then others in smaller amounts. But start utilizing that resource, because the timeline is coming in for deadlines in December, I think, for applications. So if you know any youngsters who are going on to college and would like a little extra, that's one resource for you. And look around also in your local groups. Rotaries always give them, women's clubs always give them, other nonprofit groups. So keep your ears open for those kinds of things that can help your bottom line and enhance your child's, because that will call your child's, the group's attention to your child, which will be beneficial to him or her later on as he materializes or matriculates and comes back in. So file that away and start doing your telephoning and looking, because it would be very worthwhile. There are all kinds of other places to volunteer, and I think volunteering, particularly in historical societies, is worthwhile. We have a county-wide historical society that we've had for 25 years, and all the museums belong, and we get together twice a year, and we visit each other's museums so we can have a show and tell. And we're going to see the next exhibit at the Reagan next week, the one on the spies. So if any of you who are interested, why, we'll be doing that. And I don't think there's too much more to talk about. I've just been chattering and jabbering.
Well, I'm sure we have some questions. I have a question. Do you have any favorite stories to share within your 30-plus years of teaching?
Well, the ones that come to mind were when I was teaching in Ventura, and
What grade?
I taught 7, 8, and 9.
Oh.
They're neither fish nor fowl, and the sap is rising in the tree. And there were those who were...
That's great. Sorry, I've never heard that one. That's fantastic. The
But
sap is rising in tree. That's brilliant.
Isn't that it?
That's wonderful. It's really, I love it. I can't believe I've never heard that. It's fantastic. Oh,
You haven't been where the maple trees are, I guess.
Oh, I have goosebumps. I love it.
But it's so apropos.
It really is.
Yeah. And you never know from one day to the next whether the beasts or the burdens will be the worst. But anyhow,
That's the joy of it.
every day is different.
Yeah.
No day was ever boring. No day was ever boring. You just wondered sometimes, but no day was boring. But there were those youngsters who always were testing, and we had a boys counselor and a girls counselor, and the man came in one day and he says, "I want you to watch that one kid in this class. I think he's on dope." Now I want you girls to realize this is been about 1955, 55, 56. And what had happened was they had taken one of their friends and killed him, put him in the dump, in the Ventura dump, took all his clothes and were distributing them among the group to wear, and they were wearing them to school. And they were, now this is, in the days when everybody was pure, and there were no big stories. This is when nothing was happening. And this kind of, the other story was a group of girls, and the fathers were all the attorneys, the judges, the doctors. And there was a store downtown called Jack Rose's that everybody liked to go to. Some of you may remember it. And the girls went in and they began trying on bathing suits, but they didn't take them off. So then they left the store and they got home and took them off and then went back to school and put them in their school lockers. And it was discovered, and so of course the police came to call. But it's experiences like that that are, it's very clear that when they talk about things that are happening now, nothing is new. Nothing is new. And it's just a different group of people who are figuring out a different way to devise something that will be irritating or disconcerting or uncomfortable or illegal.
Did you have young children at the time when you were teaching? Did you
I
need to
did
have
when we were here in
childcare for them,
Moorpark,
or
yes.
What did you do for childcare?
Took him to school. I waited until he was school age.
Yeah, okay.
which was about like this, because we live in the country, and in those days, the most exciting thing was the mail delivery. And I live on a street road now that I'll wait 15 minutes to get out of my driveway. And in those days, it would be 15 minutes between cars.
Wow.
So it was, and then when you get completely out of your environment where you've made friends and been visiting and know where to shop and all those things and have money, because by then we were living on $300 a month, it was very difficult. Very difficult, because you had no way to escape and no break. So that once in a while when I'd get away, my son I could take him to mother. But then on the other hand, if you were you'd have $300 at the beginning of the month, and the next day you paid the bills, and then the next day there was nothing but $15 till the beginning of the next month. And that doesn't give you too much freedom at all. But that's the way it is when you start a business too. Things have improved.
Will you share the story of how Charlie, your husband, proposed to you?
Well, when I was teaching in Ventura, I decided I wanted to learn to fly. And in those days, there were very few restrictions as far as airport landing strips could be. And I don't know how familiar you are with Pierpont Boulevard and Seaward, but when you go down Seaward and turn left on Pierpont, at one time there were just a few houses on either side of Seaward, and then on the left side was a big sugar beet field. And one of Charlie's friends had a landing strip there, and because he had a couple planes, he'd built some hangars. So Charlie had already learned to fly and gotten several licenses. And so the fellow from whom I was learning to fly had a little T-craft, and it was in the same little airport. And so I would chug along on this strip like this, and there would be all the guys in the hangar, and they would be doing their grunt work on the weekends with the engines hanging open or hanging half out, and because most of the airplanes were, several of them were WW2 training engines, because they could do aerobatics with those rather than the smaller planes, which couldn't tolerate the stress. So anyhow, I saw this guy drive by, because that's what he was doing, with his little helmet and goggles and everything, and he was chugging along, and I wondered who that guy was. And we started, as time went on, and I was in and out of the airport. He asked me if I wanted to go for a ride, and I said sure, because it was a Ryan, the kind that doesn't have a top. You know, it was open, so you'd have to wear a parachute and be strapped in with that, and so forth and so on. So I went up, and it was quite fun. And as time went on, we went up again. And the nicest thing was he'd do an Emmelman. And you go down like this, and you come up like this, and when you turn over, you're weightless. Boy, that's great. Tell you, when I talked about doing that sort of thing, everybody thought I was, a bit loony. So as time went along, we kept flying, and I kept trying to fly. And things got to be pretty interesting. And after we'd known each other for 3 weeks, we were up flying, and we would go out usually towards Santa Paula, because there's always the airport there that was nice for landing. And my mother's house was on 126, because we had a house that had been built in about 1880, that my dad and mother and the rest of us had purchased the ranch, the 50 acres there. and Mother and Dad. Mother decided she was going to move out there by darn no matter what anybody said. And she did. And so we would fly along 126 just to wave like this, you know, to everybody. And so one day he did it, and he was inverted when he was doing it. And he was flying down 126, and we had communication because the helmets had earphones, and we could talk back and forth. And the first comment was, well, how are you doing? Fine. And what do you think? Fine. And then, will you marry me? When I was like this. And he says, I'm not turning over until you say yes. Well, I don't have to say much more.
That was truly a match made in the heavens.
And how many years married?
55.
Wow.
It'll be 56 for this time, you know, that we've been together. But
So what prompted a woman of your age at the time to want to be interested in flying? Because I doubt there were many women trained to
there,
be pilots.
you'd be surprised. There were
Really?
3 or 4 women in this county
Wow.
who were very well known as aviators. And in fact, a la Amelia, you see, she had created a whole genre throughout the United States among women who could afford it, because it was still a very expensive habit to have, and one that if you were doing it regularly could deplete a bank account very quickly. Yes, that's what I found.
So you found him.
Well, I figured after I found him and we decided to get married, I didn't need a pilot's license anyway. But we didn't fly for too much longer because we found that the cost of it was one thing. But the other thing that was very challenging was the insurance. And since my family had property, that insurance level would be prohibitive. And nobody needed an airplane in the business. So if we were to fly, it would be our business, you see. So it didn't last too much longer, but it was satisfactory while it lasted. And he still had chances to go up once in a while when it was the right kind of weather and his friends were there. But at least it achieved one of my goals and one of his. Because each of us was the last of our siblings to marry, and both mothers were quite sure we were going to be old maids and old men.
How old were you when you did marry?
1930. 30.
Oh, you were
Yeah, I was. That's why I say they were really praying.
Yeah. In that era,
Yeah, that was really quite something. And then we didn't have our son until I was almost 35. And by that time, most in the family who'd already had children or almost grandparents. So
what are your passions now?
what are my passions? Well, I feel so strongly about scholarships and opportunities for kids, regardless of the background of the kid, regardless of the cost, because I'm convinced that if youngsters really want an education, they can always get it because there are people who will help them. The schools are willing to bend over backwards if they're willing to put their share into it as well. And that's where I think so many kids feel it's their due. You know, I'm me, so I should get it.
Right.
And I don't feel that that's what we should do it with.
Right.
So we're very careful about the scholarships that we've given out, but you can't imagine how much fun it is to read some of those things. And I've been doing it now for, 15 years, 20, 18 years. And the thing that has so bothered me is the deterioration in the writing.
I'm with you.
I can't, the quality that they was, pretty good a few years ago. And now they not only don't know how to write, but if they didn't have spell check, they wouldn't spell. I want
the
you.
instant gratification of your iPhone, or they just, they type it and it fixes it for them. It's not instant
Right.
gratification.
Lisa's a
with
teacher. You
kids.
teach third
Yeah.
grade.
And
I
they
don't agree with it, but it's that instant gratification. They can't wait a second to
Respond to a
look
friend.
back or correct it. They like that. It's instant for them.
But I think it's also the reading. I don't think that there's enough of the really good reading that we used to do. That because I think I have a sophomore and a senior, and they want to be able to write better, but they just don't have the. And they were pretty good, but they're nowhere near where we were.
No, I don't
we
think so either.
Have there's something
Reading
missing.
to read, just reading for the love of reading.
Yeah.
Now they
Uh-huh.
have to read so much, that's all they do.
And yet today I was at an event at the foundation, and they were talking about the educational system that we have now, and the fact that so much of our educational system now is putting young people through without their grasping what it is they're doing. And so they're finishing high school, wanting to go to college, and they're still on a 9th or 10th grade level for reading, for writing, for all the things that should be 13th grade in order to be a freshman. And
It's the amount of expectations that are put on the teachers